Good evening and good afternoon to everyone who's joining us now and those who are coming on the call. I'm Sarah Flounders, and I will be moderating this webinar for the SanctionsKill Campaign and the Venezuela Solidarity Network. Now, our title tonight is Venezuela, a high-stakes election threatened by U.S. sanctions. A co-host is the Venezuela Solidarity Network, who focuses on lifting the deadly U.S. sanctions and fighting against all forms of imperialist attacks against Venezuela. VSN is a catalyst for solidarity work around Venezuela. Their site is VenezuelaSolidarityNetwork.org. Couldn't be simpler. I am a contributing editor to Workers' World News, and I help to coordinate the SanctionsKill Campaign, which is a campaign that focuses on the illegal criminal attacks on millions of defenseless civilians who are deliberately targeted by U.S. sanctions in 40 developing and formerly colonized countries globally. That's a third of the world population. Our website is SanctionsKill.org. And I want to open with giving special thanks to the United National Anti-War Coalition, UNAC, who is hosting tonight's webinar, and their website is unacpeace.org. Now, everyone here tonight is suffering through wall-to-wall coverage of the U.S. elections. It's all we hear. Trump versus Biden, then Harris, Republican and Democrat, and we're assured that this is democracy, and it has nothing to do with democracy. In the midst of this circus, there's no coverage of what the U.S. is doing around the world to undermine and destroy real democracy, to block elections, to fund opposition groups, and most painful of all, to try to destabilize whole societies. As a war criminal, Henry Kissinger said, the goal is to make the economy scream. Now, I've traveled to sanctioned countries, it seems, all my life. Solidarity delegations are a form of internationalism. So Palestine, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and others. I've seen the enormous pain of empty shelves, no medicine for sick children, total infrastructure breakdown when you can't replace a battery or a spare part. But I've also seen mobilizations and the creative energy of millions who are determined to withstand U.S. efforts to strangle their revolutions. So tonight, we're going to examine sanctions in Venezuela, a silent weapon of aggressive intervention. And we're going to discuss how the Chavistas have mobilized the whole population. The upcoming election in Venezuela, which is scheduled for July 28th, are in the crosshairs of another U.S. attempted orchestrated regime change operation. U.S. politicians have already intentionally created years of economic hardship by freezing assets and blocking essential imports of medicines and basic infrastructure, by imposing extreme economic sanctions. It's U.S. corporate power's weapon of choice. Sanctions are by design U.S. imperialism's most ignored weapon. They're silent, yet they exert unrelenting pressure. Now, in preparation for this latest round of voting, the U.S. media has once again declared, even before the vote takes place, that the elections are rigged. Their well-funded opposition slates, which have the lowest level of popularity, are declared in advance to be the only acceptable choices. U.S. agencies have funneled millions of dollars to fund and create both opposition media, opposition polling mechanisms, opposition political parties. sanctions, really more correctly, economic coercive measures. Let's remember that term, economic coercive measures. They're a brutal weapon that impacts the whole population. It's especially cruel in the toll on the most vulnerable people in every society. Hyperinflation that intentionally impacts the poorest, those without any savings or extra resources. Now, U.S. corporate power is up against the overwhelming popularity of the twice-elected President Nicolás Maduro's government and an intense grassroots mobilization. And that's what we're going to hear about tonight, of the whole population to survive under harsh war conditions and to actually thrive in the difficult conditions of scarcity. It's quite an accomplishment for revolutionary Venezuela. The extreme hardships imposed on oil and resource-rich Venezuela are really one of the most brutal examples of the U.S. sanctions weapon. Under the Hugo Chávez government, the government was able to use the oil and gas resources to rapidly build schools, universities, hospitals, thousands of corner clinics, along with electricity, sewers, potable water lines into the poorest barrios. There were millions of low-cost housing units under construction across the country. During these years, the revolutionary government of Hugo Chávez, he was in office from 1998 until his early, untimely death in 2013. And during that time, there were enormous, life-changing structural changes in Venezuela, in the culture, in the people, healthier, more educated, in the infrastructure. These changes, though, threatened the profits of the largest U.S. oil and gas and banking corporations. U.S. imposed sanctions against Venezuela started in 2005, but by 2014, Washington accelerated the sanctions in a concerted effort to undermine the newly elected government of President Maduro and to distort the electoral outcomes. By 2018, sanctions reached a whole new level and systematically blocked basic medicines for immunization shots, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, nutritional supplements, spare parts for equipment, even water and electricity couldn't be bought on the international market. Venezuela was blocked from selling its oil and gas on international markets. Countries around the world threatened, don't you dare trade with Venezuela or you will also be fined. Billions of dollars of Venezuelans' foreign assets were seized. Against every sanctioned country, the U.S. government demands that every other country go along with the sanctions or face fines, seizure of funds. That's why the cost of the most essential products becomes an enormous obstacle. The U.S. uses the same template in country after country. And the charges raised against every one of the 40 countries sanctioned by the U.S. government are usually the same template. Venezuela is no exception. Targeted governments and countries under U.S. sanctions attack its first, they're declared guilty by the U.S. corporate media. And the whole U.S. political establishment then joins in demonizing the leadership as guilty of criminal, anti-democratic, or corrupt actions. The claim, endlessly repeated, is that imposed sanctions are only targeting criminal individuals and enterprises. That's a total fraud. The blockade is designed to throw the entire economy into shock. Now, the mass media here, though, just repeats again and again that the economic dislocation, the wild inflation, the shortages of essential products are caused by the leaders because they're corrupt or inept or paid off. Slanderous terms declaring elected leaders to be autocrats, dictators, are used repeatedly in every news to resist an orchestrated U.S. takedown. or regime change operation. It takes even more to build a force capable of mobilizing a population in the midst of scarcity. The need is both to survive and to thrive. And this is the challenge that Venezuela has undertaken with great determination and revolutionary fervor. The creative tactics used against the full weight of the US government, that's the focus of tonight's speakers. And our first speaker, I'm so honored to introduce Dr. Maria PAEZ VICTOR. A Canadian-Venezuelan, and next following Dr. Maria PAEZ VICTOR will be Joe EMERSBERGER, who is the co-author and 20 years of coup attempts in Venezuela. So while they give their presentations, I will ask everyone, there's a lot in the chat already, and it's good to, if you want to introduce yourself, your name or your organization, but let's hold down the chatter or discussion during their presentations, but do put your questions in the Q&A section. We will try to deal with every one of them as we move forward. So thank you very much. I'm seeing a message that the sound is unstable. I think it's good on my end, and Joe, you can check on yours. But if you're having trouble, hearing on your end, you might go out and come back in. It could be your connection, at least on our end, where we are checking, and we will continue. So if others are having, say, put questions in the Q&A section, chance for both Dr. Maria PAEZ VICTOR and for Joe EMERSBERGER to answer them. And tonight we're going to give Joe Lombardo, who is our host with UNAC, he'll have the first question when we open the floor for the Q&A. But first, Dr. Maria PAEZ VICTOR, if you would, explain about the situation in Venezuela today and this people's mobilization.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That is just an amazing, superb introduction. You know so much about what's happening. I'm so glad that you gave that summary. I really, really appreciate it. You obviously know what is happening. Thank you. Well, I'm very honored to be on this webinar. I want to thank the Venezuelan Solidarity Network and SanctionsKill Campaign. I'm so honored to be on a panel with Joe EMERSBERGER and SARA FLOUNDER, who both have demonstrated an absolutely amazing solidarity with the people of Venezuela in their hour of need. This is really wonderful of you both. And of course, Joe Lombardo also. There are a few things that it is necessary to stress about the situation in Venezuela right now, because in the presidential elections that are about to take place this Sunday, on the 28th of July, the sanctions are the elephant in the room for two reasons. First, because of the tremendous damage that they have done. And secondly, because of the almost miraculous turnaround in the economy that Maduro's government team has achieved despite the sanctions. Now, the far right, and when I say far right, I'm talking about true fascist people, especially the PUD, that's Maria Corina Machado and her puppet, Edmundo González. They try to blame the Chavistas for the economic troubles and simply deny that the sanctions have had any effect, despite the studies and despite the UN pronunciation to the contrary. The far right's implicit and explicit message is that vote for them because they will get rid of the sanctions, as they have excellent relationships with Washington. The far right ignores the successful economic measures of Maduro's team, which have in fact defeated a great deal of the sanctions. And to understand this is what Sarah was talking about, Venezuela is a beleaguered nation. It's beleaguered by illegal, vicious hybrid war, which is unleashed by the USA and its allies and some of its corporations. This includes open violence, such as coup d'etat attempts, assassination attempts and assassinations, sabotage, bribing criminals, cyber attacks, attacks on the currency by international finance agencies, and a comprehensive media deluge of lies and false accusations, which you have carefully talked about. Venezuela was forbidden to produce and sell its petroleum, buy and sell on the international market, especially medicines and food. It was banned from international financial transactions, such as the use of the SWIFT, and it had no access to their own bank accounts. Now, many in the West believe the sanctions are supposedly soft, a soft tool of attack. The unilateral economic sanctions are meant to collapse the economy so that the government falls. And Venezuela has suffered 930 illegal sanctions. Only Russia has more sanctions than Venezuela. 54% of those sanctions are imposed by the USA, 14% imposed by Canada, and 7% imposed by the European Union. Now, these sanctions are not soft. They leave a path of death and disease. In Venezuela, at least 100,000 people have died directly due to the economic sanctions that have impeded the buying of food and medicine. The harm is just as harmful as dropping bombs. And I'm going to quote here an article in the Financial Times, making economic sanctions possibly the deadliest weapon used by Western powers. Now, here's the thing. The prostituted international media in its articles severely criticized Venezuela and especially President Maduro, but hardly ever mention the sanctions as causes of the dire economic and political troubles of the country. It is absurd, but it is also on purpose. The Venezuelan state lost 90% of its revenue. Just think of that, 90% of the revenue of a state. The oil industry lost 80% of its production, and it's estimated that that cost $232 billion. The hyperinflation was provoked, and it reached levels unimaginable in the tens of thousands percentage, such that the currency became almost meaningless. Only in nations utterly defeated and destroyed in war with bombs had such a hyperinflation existed before. Sanctions have allowed the shameless, immoral, illegal looting of Venezuelan assets. Between 2016 and 2020 alone, Venezuela lost 194 billion. That's equivalent to 16 months of national production. The entire foreign debt could have been paid with that, or we could have imported enough food and medicine for 60 years. So 7 billion illegally taken by foreign banks, 5 billion illegally taken by, guess what? The International Monetary Fund. 2 billion taken, those are the 31 tons of Venezuelan gold pirated by the English in the Bank of England, and 10 billion obtained by the United States that looted, that took away from Venezuela CICO, which was Venezuela's oil company in the United States. So please, United States, Canada, EU, spare us the sanctimonious talk about you abiding by the rule of law and the care for democracy of the supposed international community. They have looted, robbed, sabotaged, tried to invade, ordered assassinations, provoked migrations, damaged the currency, and maligned the nation of Simón Bolívar. Now, we're not just talking about numbers. There's been catastrophic impact on the Venezuelan population. We're talking about people and what they have had to suffer. As I mentioned, 100,000 died in 1 year alone, 2017 to 18, 40,000 died that year. 2.6 million children did not receive their regular vaccinations. 5,859 hemophiliacs could not get medication. 2.5 million patients could not get blood-related products. 8,000 HIV patients couldn't get antiviral medicines. 16,000 patients that needed dialysis couldn't get it. 16 other thousand that had cancer went without medicines. 4 million with diabetes and hypertension could not be treated, and thousands of operations and treatments could not be done. So these are not just numbers, but people. I will tell you, my very, very dear first cousin died of cancer because the medicines that could have prolonged her life were not available anywhere in the country. My octogenarian sister with glaucoma is now blind, and she struggled to get the eye drops that were necessary that would have prevented this blindness. But more unconscionable, immoral, and hard, really hard to forgive is that the United States and Canada banned COVID vaccines to be sold or donated to Venezuela in the midst of a world pandemic. Who can believe this? But the sanctions were also a bit of a boomerang, as thousands of Venezuelans migrated to the USA and other countries, a migration that they themselves programmed and abetted. Although afterwards they considered it a huge problem when all these people showed up at their borders. People were making money arranging for these migrations. And the reprobate son of a family friend was in on this business, smuggling people through Panama to get over there. These migrants, on the whole, did not find nirvana and they wanted to come back. And what happened was that the government of Venezuela sent planes to bring them back free of charge. I don't know of any other country in the world who has done this. The sanctions are condemned by the United Nations because they're illegal. They violate a series of international laws and commercial regulations, including the Charter of the UN and the Geneva Convention. They go against sovereignty, self-determination of peoples, freedom of trade, freedom of navigation, non-discrimination, the prohibition of the use of force. And 2 human rights rapporteurs have rallied and spoken against it. Dr. Alfred de Saya considers that they are crimes against humanity. He considers that they are just like the sieges in the Middle Ages that were designed to starve a population into surrendering. He states that they are a form of state terrorism because they kill indiscriminately. The history of sanctions is one of suffering and devastation. Elena Duhan, another rapporteur, says, of course, it violates international law, and she talks about the devastating effect on Venezuela, and she said that they are a blow against the nation's sovereignty. On November 2023, 128 nations in the United Nations voted that all sanctions should cease to 40 countries, that they should be lifted. Well, to no avail. But throughout these attacks and hardships, China, Russia, Iran, Turkey, and Cuba came to Venezuela's aid, and quite heroically also, and that will never be forgotten. But here's the thing. The sanctions failed to do what they said that they were going to do. They failed to overthrow the Bolivarian government of President Maduro. How? Why did Venezuela not collapse? How could the country survive a blow like this to its economy? Well, it was not easy. It was not easy. But Maduro and his team tried many things, but on the whole, this is what saved Venezuela. First of all, the population rallied around its government as it perceived that they were being attacked by an external enemy, the USA and their allies. It was Maduro and his team that were seen rightly as protecting with all their might the people of Venezuela, and therefore the sanctions gave Maduro a greater standing in popularity. Second, on the other hand, the opposition did nothing useful indeed. They were the ones who actually asked Washington to impose sanctions. Plus, Maria Corina Machado has said many times, asked the US to militarily invade Venezuela. Who can think that would want this for their own country? And people will not soon forget that these fascists, Machado, Capriles, Guaidó, backed by Washington, backed by the racist Venezuelan elites, have never ceased to try to create chaos and overthrow the government. In 2014, they were responsible for the virulent street violence that led to 43 deaths, 878 injured, and millions in damage. In 2017, they continued with 121 deaths and 1,958 injured, including the horrendous death of a young man, Orlando Figuera. Because his skin was dark, he looked Chavista. And guess what? They burned him alive right there on the street. People don't forget this. The government put all its efforts in diversifying the economy. We used, in our economy, everything was the United States. Everything that to do with buying and selling was of the United States. So Maduro put all his efforts in diversifying the economy, bolstering the small and medium-sized enterprise, opening new markets in other parts of the world, which we had never even thought of before, markets for Venezuelan products. And he created economic zones for foreign and national investments under a particular law that protected the names of those investors so that they wouldn't be caught with the sanctions. Now, Maduro has made peace with and lured the domestic private sector. Their maximum representative is Fede Cámaras, which is a chamber of commerce. And they have done an about-face. From being the leaders of the coups against the government and of the economic sabotages, the private financial sector finally has realized that they too have been hurt by the sanctions, that they cannot do business or open accounts in international banks. As well, Maduro has lured them with the law of safeguards for investors and the economic zones and the new world markets that the government has negotiated. It is significant that Machado and González do not have the backing of the powerful Fede Cámaras for this election. Now, remarkably, demonstrating that it is a lie that the country is polarized, it is now 11 opposition mayors who have renounced the opposition and who have joined the Maduro camp. And all have said the same thing, that it is Maduro who can guarantee the peace in the country. Sixth, well, Venezuela has learned to feed itself. It became self-sufficient in food due to the great support and effort that the government has done for agriculture. And the rural communal councils and communes became the ones that fed the nation. Venezuela no longer imports food. Seventh, well, solidarity. Socialism is solidarity. This solidarity, so meticulously nurtured for 25 years by the PSUV, came into its own with all the grassroots organizations with which the PSUV has always been working with. They helped in a host of ways to feed, to tend, to care for the population. The neighborhood networks of the PSUV, the urban communal councils, the groups of all sorts just jumped in to help in many ways. People began to trade, to barter, to help each other, even without payments. For example, my sister lives in the city of Caracas, and last year there was 2 years ago there was a blackout, and people were. This was during Trump. People were worried, thinking that Trump was going to invade, and the lights went out. Well, she got a phone call 15 minutes later from the neighborhood leader, who, by the way, wasn't there. He was in another town. Called her up to tell her, and this is what he did to everyone in the block. Don't worry, this is a real problem in one of the electrical places. It is not sabotage. It is not an invasion. Don't worry, the lights will come back. This is what the PSUV is about. It isn't just an electoral thing. They are there working with the people day and night. And so I'll give you another example. My niece's apartment building. She said she needed nothing. I said, what do you need? What do you need? Nothing. Because people cooked for each other, bartered goods and services. And nearby people that lived in a more rural way in the same neighborhood came by every week to sell or barter what they grew. And this happened all over the country, in neighborhoods and in city buildings. Another of my elderly sisters, I have lots of sisters. Well, another of my elderly sisters who lives alone not only got the monthly food package delivered to her by the local neighborhood PSUV group, but they even offered to bring her ready-made cooked food if she should need it. You see, the government gave absolute priority. Some of them didn't even get paid with their salary during this period. They gave absolute priority to the bi-monthly food packages, and that is why there was no famine in the country. And I will say that we should not forget the impetus of history. Venezuela's glory is its history, one of rebellion against an empire. It is the nation that defeated the formidable Spanish Empire and liberated 5 other nations to boot. Our indigenous and Black people have a long, sterling history of many rebellions against slavery and servitude. And history tells the people today to look towards that for strength, especially when those struggles that actually took place were successful in the end. That history is embedded in their national identity, and it is beckoning the people of Venezuela to live up to it as it faces yet another murderous empire. And finally, Maduro has had a triumphant tour through all the corners of Venezuela, where he has been greeted with exuberant expressions of support, affection, and much happiness. He is seen as the leader who managed to bypass the Yankee sanctions and has brought a good measure of prosperity back. And above all, he has defended the homeland of Bolivar. Without a doubt, he will win the presidency handsomely on Sunday, the 28th of July, 2024, the day of Chávez's birthday. Thank you very much.
Wow, Maria, that's a fabulous, fabulous talk. And I do hope you'll send us the transcript, because we should really send it and make it available. We always share afterwards to everyone who registers for our webinars a link to the YouTube. Joe does a light edit, but I just want to say that was tremendous, and we should send a link to your talk. And I think we'll have to give the same task, send us his transcripts to Joe EMERSBERGER. He is the co-author of Extraordinary Threat: The U.S. Empire, the Media, and 20 Years of Coup Attempts in Venezuela. So Joe, please join us. And I really can't wait for all this too. So much I've learned, really. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much to everyone involved in organizing this webinar. I'm honored to have been asked to speak. I'll be putting a transcript of this talk on my Substack page for people who are interested in citations that support what I say. My task here is to discuss the Western media's coverage of Venezuela's upcoming election. I feel I must start by saying that the same big Western media outlets that dare to impugn Venezuela's election are, as I speak, facilitating a genocide in Gaza. In today's world, where anyone with an iPhone and an internet connection could potentially do very devastating journalism, the Western media is not the effective gatekeeper that it used to be in the pre-internet era. The same way we can readily access horrific images from Gaza every day, we can also easily access the images of the huge and boisterous rallies Maduro has held all over Venezuela during his election campaign. We can easily access Telesur, Orinoco Tribune, Venezuela Analysis, Fair.org, Mint Press News, and countless other voices online that refute in great detail what the Nazified Western media claims about Venezuela. Nevertheless, Western media will try to impose as much ignorance as it can and trap our minds within Western imperial assumptions and encourage the casual bigotry that has been fostered within Western societies for centuries. Their power to do so is reduced from what it was decades ago, but it remains important, unfortunately. As elections approach in Venezuela, we get the same toxic journalism about Venezuela that we always see from Western media, but more of it, and with a much heavier emphasis on polls. I'll pick an example from Bloomberg that was published on July 20. You really only need one example because it follows the same general pattern that's been repeated constantly in one Reuters or Associated Press article after another over the past few months. Bloomberg claimed that the election will be marred by, I quote, an insufficient number of credible international observers this year. And the article also said, I quote, most credible polls in early July showed an average 20-point lead in the race by the opposition. Now, Bloomberg's article does not explain why those polls and those international observers like the Carter Center, whom it named, deserve to be labeled credible. I did a talk a few weeks ago that explained in detail why the Carter Center, despite not being as bad as other Western imperial outfits, does not deserve to be labeled as credible. Now, getting back to the polls, Venezuelan economist Francisco Rodriguez, who is anti-Maduro, pointed out on Twitter that opposition-aligned pollsters have since 2017, and especially since 2017, greatly exaggerated opposition support. He did a mathematical adjustment of the polls for the upcoming election that took into account the inaccuracy of pollsters after 2015. Based on his analysis, he concluded that the opposition candidate, Edmundo Gonzalez, who is a stand-in for the disqualified Maria Corina Machado, probably has a statistically negligible lead over Maduro of like 0.2 of a percentage point. So absolutely nothing like the 20-point lead that Bloomberg claims. In 2017, the opposition was widely predicted to sweep regional elections, according to the pollsters that Bloomberg labels as credible. The exact opposite happened. Maduro and his allies swept those elections, and fraud could not begin to explain the results. I mean, that's a key point. Fraud has never been able to explain the inaccuracy of the opposition-aligned pollsters. The Bloomberg article actually mentioned the 2017 regional elections in order to point what it calls proof of vote tampering in one state that year. What Bloomberg didn't tell its readers is that the alleged vote tampering accounted for less than 5,000 votes in an election that the opposition lost in the nationwide tally by 700,000 votes. In other words, those elections showed that the pollsters Bloomberg labels as credible are not credible at all. Now, Bloomberg knows this, of course. How could Bloomberg know about less than 5,000 disputed votes in one state, but not know about the wildly inaccurate polling before those elections? And even if Bloomberg had no background knowledge, the obvious question any credible journalist will ask about a pollster is, well, how accurate have they been in the past? But ignoring that obvious question allows Bloomberg to impugn the election results in advance if they don't go the way Bloomberg wants. In other words, if Maduro wins. If you discredit a Maduro victory in advance, then you are also helping the US justify the continuation of sanctions. And that's what Bloomberg and all these outlets are up to when they uncritically report those opposition-aligned polls over and over again. Now, according to Rodriguez's analysis, the election will likely be extremely close. Of course, there is no guarantee that the polling errors of the past will be repeated on Sunday. The errors could get much smaller, stay the same as in recent years, or they could get even worse, larger errors. So Rodriguez was shocked. We should recall, Rodriguez was shocked by the regional elections of 2017 because the polling errors that year got much larger than they had been in the years before. So nobody should be shocked by a Maduro win at all. And in fact, even a large landslide Maduro win should not be shocking to people. The Western media wants us to think that's impossible without fraud. It knows that many casual readers will not delve into the details of how fraud-proof Venezuela's electoral system is, so ignoring the track record of pollsters is a clever propaganda tactic. Now, moving on, Bloomberg and all the others also have very little to say about Maria Corina Machado. She is the real driving force behind the Edmundo Gonzalez campaign. She is described merely as an opposition leader, sometimes as a fierce critic of Maduro, who has been banned from public office. Now, that's an incredibly light punishment for what she has done, but you'd never learn that from the likes of Bloomberg. Now, in talking about Machado, news articles never say that she has repeatedly tried to incite a foreign military invasion of Venezuela. Now, I'll give one example from, and I have the video of this that I put on my Twitter timeline today. On February 11th of 2019, as many of us feared that Trump might actually go through with an invasion of Venezuela because US troops were very menacingly stationed on the Colombian border as part of an aid stunt, Machado publicly called on the opposition-controlled National Assembly at the time to invoke Article 187, subsection 11 of Venezuela's constitution, which allows the National Assembly to authorize foreign troops on Venezuela's soil. In the same speech in 2019, that same speech, he called for the international community to apply the so-called responsibility to protect doctrine to Venezuela. That's the doctrine that Western liberals invoked to justify NATO's destruction of Libya in 2011. In the same speech, she also called for Venezuela's military to defy Maduro and accept the Trump-appointed Juan Guaido as their commander-in-chief. Now, more often, Machado's repeated calls for foreign invasion of her own country take the form of incitement, depicting her own country as a grave threat to the world. She often does this in English on her Twitter account. Now, Machado has tweeted, for example, I quote, "Venezuela is a hub for international organized crime, anti-Western forces, drug trafficking, and terrorism. We must act now," unquote. She tweets this incitement in English, but Western media hide it anyway. And I don't even have the time to get into her involvement with multiple US-backed coup attempts since 2002. Now, you cannot overemphasize the cynicism of a Bloomberg article and countless others just like it that make no mention of any of that. Maria Corina Machado should be in a Venezuelan jail. Unless you accept the US and its allies have the right to rule the world as emperors, that's an inescapable conclusion. but there is no room for that perspective in the so-called free press that Western imperialists claim they have. Now, if Venezuela were to cripple the USA's economy, if it made perfectly clear that it would only stop doing so if a presidential candidate wins in November that it approves of, what conclusions would we draw from that? Wouldn't that be called illegitimate election interference? In this wildly hypothetical scenario, Venezuela's actions would be called acts of war. The election interference aspect, I think, would be ignored completely. The only thing debated in Western media would be how heavily to bomb Venezuela in retaliation for its acts of war. Now, I'd like to now pivot to something else. Now, because as much as the media hides information, I'd say most of the time, there are also times when it can't help but reveal key truths, not out of integrity, but because of a deep-seated belief that Venezuelans must submit to US-led rule. I'll leave you with some examples that I think are important. In 2003, I'm going to go back to 2003, 2 months after an opposition-led lockout of the oil industry devastated Venezuela's economy, but failed to overthrow the government. The New York Times reporter Juan Ferrero nonchalantly wrote, "For some opposition leaders, the strategy is now to lie low and watch the economy worsen, hoping that the president will be dragged down with it." So economic warfare and the hope that it will install US allies goes way back, as does the Western media's normalization of it. Another, even more striking example came in June 2017 in this long article, "Cry for Venezuela" was the title, by Toronto Globe and Mail reporter Stephanie Nolan. It was a long article just clearly intended to generate outrage against Maduro. But deep inside the article, Nolan wrote, and I quote, "The opposition's chief hope is that the Maduro regime finally will go completely broke when the food runs out entirely." I'm repeating that. When the food runs out entirely, the thinking goes, the streets will fill and people won't go home until he leaves. So Nolan and her editors could not be bothered to remove these incredibly damning lines from their article. Canada's allies in Venezuela want the country to starve, but Nolan and her editors didn't notice anything shocking about that. That's not surprising if you see the US and its allies as the world's rightful rulers. Another example, a Reuters article of August 2020 mentioned in passing that, and I quote, "The United States this month seized 4 cargoes of Iranian fuel bound for Venezuela, where fuel shortages are once again worsening." And again, I'll repeat that, "where fuel shortages are once again worsening." I mean, that's, again, another perfunctory mention of a US crime against humanity, an act of war against the civilian population. And finally, final examples from the New York Times exactly 1 year ago, July 22nd, 2023. This editorial stated that sanctions on Venezuela are, I quote, "deeply unpopular in Venezuela." So it admits that the sanctions that Washington imposes under the pretext of restoring democracy actually aren't wanted by Venezuelans. Now, that's an outrageous thing to concede unless you've completely internalized the idea that the US is the legitimate ruler of Venezuela, not Venezuelans. Now, even the title of that editorial gives the US barbarism away. The title refers to America's foreign policy arsenal. Now, note the word arsenal. What arsenal would Venezuela be allowed to use against the United States, according to the New York Times? The editorial writers also conceded that US sanctions on Venezuela have been lethal. In their words, the sanctions, I quote, "exacerbated a humanitarian crisis." Well, if you exacerbate a humanitarian crisis, that can only mean that they've killed people. How many people would Venezuela be allowed to kill in the United States with an economic arsenal? I mean, to sum up, US sanctions on Venezuela are acts of war and massive election interference. As much as the establishment media hides those truths, you can find them out if you're willing to spend some time bypassing the Western media. But even if you look closely enough at Western media, you'll find that there are times when the truth gets inadvertently revealed. Now, finally, I'll just say I hope Maduro wins on Sunday. My guess is that he will. But if he doesn't, the real winner will be Washington, not Edmundo Gonzalez, not even Maria Corina Machado. US acts of war will have succeeded as they did in Nicaragua in 1990 and producing the desired electoral outcome. And no civilized person should want to see that. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Joe. What an indictment. That was really tremendous. As we continue, I mean, this is really quite incredible, and I do hope you will send us. These are really excellent points. And done so tight. Now I'm going to open the floor for Q&A. as I earlier gave the websites, and I do hope people do remember to tune in at a later time, not right now, to Venezuela Solidarity Network.org, to SanctionsKill.org, and to UNACpeace.org. We're going to open the floor for Q&A. And as I say, Joe has the first question. I don't see other questions in the Q&A. So our audience, we have a big audience today, and that's exciting to see. But for any of you who, really would like these two tremendous speakers to develop or expand on one point or another, please let us know. And I'll ask Maria and Joe to stay on so that sort of a panel, keep your sound and video on. But let me pass the floor to Joe Lombardo.
Thank you, Sarah. These discussions from Joe and Maria were very interesting to me because in some sense we've had firsthand verification of what they said. Sarah and I were on a delegation to Venezuela a few years ago, where it was a delegation of anti-war activists from the United States, and we were able to meet with President Maduro. It was a wonderful time we spent there, and we learned a lot. But while we were there was when this blackout happened that Maria talked about, where the electricity went off. And because of that, our actually flights home were delayed because the airline that was flying in, I think it was American Airline, I forget which, refused to fly in. And the reason they refused to fly in, because in the American US media, during that period, they were saying that the electricity went out and throughout the country there were riots. Well, we were in the country at that point, and not only were there not riots during this electrical outage, there was exactly what Maria said, incredible cooperation. Block committees came together, and there's some high-rise buildings in Caracas, and a lot of them were actually built to house people that didn't have homes and didn't have or were underhoused, didn't have good places to live. They had wonderful names. They were named like Malcolm X and Che Guevara were the names of these housing projects. But because of the outage, water couldn't get up to the top floors and elevators wouldn't work. So people got together in the streets and had meetings, and so-and-so lives on the 6th floor and she's 80 years old. Has anybody checked in on her yet? And young people gathered together, brought water to these people, checked in on everybody. There was a kind of community cooperation, which you could only see in a society that tries to build its society for the needs of the people. It's in the United States where you see riots when things like this happen. But in Venezuela, we saw the opposite. And it goes to Joe's presentation, too, how the media totally lied. And I remember our group, we had about 12 of us, got together after hearing about the US media, and we each recorded a statement of what we saw and got it out to social media, again, to Joe's point that it's possible today to get around the corporate media with social media. And we told people exactly what was really going on. But what people in the United States, by and large, got was that there were rioting in the streets because of the outage, and none of this was true. So I guess if I'm trying to turn that into a question, it is, we are likely, no matter what the outcomes are of this election, we are likely to see the same misinformation in our media. And so we have to prepare to counter it. UNAC will do its part to do that. I know Sanctions Kill, which UNAC is also a part of, and I know the Venezuelan Solidarity Committee will, but all of us need to do it. We need to be prepared to get this out. And if anybody else has any ideas on how we will be able to counter what we can be sure, because we've heard it already, is misinformation from our government, I'd like to hear any of their comments. So I don't know if any of the speakers would like to say anything about that, but in the meantime, I see we got a bunch of questions, so I'll look at the questions, or Sarah can look at the questions, and the speakers can answer. So I don't know where to go with that. Maybe someone wants to comment on what I see, and I see Maria has a hand up.
Well, I would like to comment. Those were 5 horrific days in Venezuela. I was here frantic trying to contact my family, but I will tell you some of the things that happened. The only outlet for news that was available was the radio of the state. And what some of the young people did in many of the buildings is somehow they got with a phone and some antenna, because young people are so clever and creative, they would get the signal. And so the people in the buildings would get together and listen to this impromptu radio that the young people would make, so that they could hear from the government what was happening. The most important message that the government had to give out was, it is not an invasion. We are not going to be invaded. Of course, perhaps maybe they thought that they might, but they were telling people, don't worry, it's not an invasion. It was a cyber attack. And I have had the same reaction. People don't believe me when I say, you know what? There was no looting in Venezuela. How can that be? What do you mean? There must have been. And what they don't understand is that in Venezuela, we don't have a mass people. People aren't a mass. It is un pueblo organizado. It is a people who is organized, and everybody belongs to a neighborhood organization of some sort. Remember, the PSUV, which is the political party, always worked with El Polo Patriótico. El Polo Patriótico was all kinds of organizations, women's organizations, children's organizations, indigenous organizations. So it's a political party that is surrounded by all kinds of other organizations. And then, of course, you have the communal councils and the communes. So all of that just started working when we had that cyber attack. And it also happened, of course, during the sanctions. But I want to tell you a little anecdote. I was privileged enough to, I would say, be in the same room with Chávez, and Chávez was speaking to us. And he was telling us about that first oil lockout that happened in 2003, where the then board of directors of the oil company locked out the workers. And so we had an oil strike. This was a very damning, terrible situation. And frankly, the country and the government wasn't prepared. So Chávez, being the way he was, got out of the palace and he said, I got to go see how my people are. And he started walking up and down the barrios, the poor areas. And when he was in this area called El Valle, there was a woman in one of the little houses, and starts calling him Chávez, Chávez, because that's how they talk to him. Chávez, Chávez, come over here, Chávez. And Chávez goes over to this elderly lady and says, look at this fire that I have here, where I'm going to cook. He says, that is my last share. I'm making this fire with the last chair that I have in this house. And then Chávez says to us, then this lady grabbed hold of my jacket and said, pero no te rindas, but don't you give up. He said, I don't care if I have to, burn my furniture. It grabbed him, and she says, he grabbed him real strong. He said, this old lady was strong, grabbed me very strong on my, and said, no te rindas, don't you give up to them. And I think that that is really symbolic, both of Chávez and of Maduro, that they're not going to give up. And I can assure you that Maduro's going to win the elections. There's no way that these fascists are going to win.
Can I just say one other thing, Sarah? I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah. No.
I just want to say something about the electoral system, which shows something about the sanctions. The electoral system was a U.S. electoral system that was put in prior to the Bolivarian Revolution. And a lot of the parts were German parts. And because of the sanctions, this was an old system. And with all the maintenance, they couldn't update it. They couldn't do maintenance because they couldn't get the parts because of the sanctions. And yet they worked out a way around that, and we haven't seen a repeat of it. That's people's power as it was seen in Venezuela. Sorry to jump in again, but thank you.
There's some very thoughtful questions, and we can't possibly, we're going to go a half hour. We can't possibly even, I think, touch these, but I will at least raise a few of them. As I say, we can't do them all. But I did want to add one little point on this delegation that Joe raised that I was part of, because when we landed, the electricity was out, so we had no idea what we were facing, and we were facing incredible solidarity. But the whole trip, we visited these urban farms, which were everywhere, every neighborhood, every squawk, every little corner of a vacant lot had an urban farm going, where fruit and vegetables, all kinds of things were being grown. That was really impressive and exciting. And the barrios are high up on the hills, so when the electricity goes out, the water pumps stop. So that water trucks had to come in. They weren't looted. They weren't grabbed. People in line with buckets to take. So it was just beyond to really see human dignity, and it rises to the occasion. Now, I'm going to raise a few of the questions and hope our panelists can take on one or the other. What was the pretext for the original sessions? There was a question, someone who came on late, and there would be a full recording. And yes, within a couple days, and everyone who registered for this webinar will get it. And we'll send it out to others widely, the YouTube link of the entire program today. And if we have a link to the presentations or a summary of them, we will also include that. So those are a couple of the points. But there was a question about, and since these are both Canadian speakers with a lot of experience on Canada, whether a campaign to get Canada to enforce a 2002 resolution on, unilateral sanctions is possible. That was, I think, an important question. And here's another question that raises, where did it go? The UN declarations of the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, the ICC and the ICJ, and all the other bodies related to the UN do not amount to much these days. They can rule the side going on right in Gaza, and yet it continues. So Bolivar in Venezuela is sanctioned against all established international norms, just like the genocidal blockade of Cuba. It's voted against by a vote in the UN, 188 in favor of lifting blockade, only 2, the UN and Israel, for keeping the blockade. What's the way forward for activists on the ground, aside from sharing the truth with ordinary citizens and to try to mobilize them? And so that's an important question that I think every solidarity activist is always grappling with, that the courts can be important for rulings, for explaining, but people's solidarity here can be a real way forward, a real tool, and it's worth thinking about. But let me ask both the panelists. I threw you 3 different questions, if you want to tackle any one of them, and there, you might see another in the Q&A that you want to deal with instead. But those struck me as of interest.
Can I? Okay, Can I just say something then?
Good, Joe, please. Yes.
Yeah, my personal opinion is that in countries like Canada, people either engage in electoral politics in a way that they basically become apologists for one of the parties that totally go along with U.S. foreign policy, whether it's in the United States, the Democrats obviously are just another faction of the ruling party. They're not even really. I don't consider them separate parties from the Republicans. And in Canada, I don't see any useful reason to get behind the NDP or any country like. But I do see a tremendous need to develop a serious political party. I mean, it's easy to say, much harder to do, but we need a real anti-imperialist, viable political party that doesn't engage in the. I think people get turned off to the whole idea of electoral politics because most political parties just go along with the imperial status quo. So I think we need a real political party that can put forth a broad platform on any number of issues. It's not easy to be done, but I think too often we're trapped between rejecting electoral politics altogether on the left and just saying, the hell with it, we're not doing that, or getting into it, but then becoming apologists for one of the establishment parties. So I don't think it has to be one of those 2 options. So that's my 2 cents on that.
That's great.
Well, I would like to add something to that. What Joe is saying is perfectly sound and rational, but it will not happen until we have electoral reform in Canada. And Justin Trudeau, when he wanted to be elected, promised to have electoral reform. And as soon as he got elected, he then forgot about having this electoral reform. And unfortunately, we're going to be caught in this limbo until we change this first past the post. Because what happens in Canada is that we get governments that get elected with 25, maybe 30% of the population, and on top of that, we have abstention. So in Canada, from my point of view, the first thing we have to do is to get this electoral reform and throw it into the face of the Liberals who had promised that they were going to have this electoral reform.
Right. Now, I see a question. It's very concrete. How many candidates are there who are running? Now, that may be a question of both presidential, but there are just everything in Venezuela is voted on, everything, every position, and there are elections all the time. So it might be good to explain that. And also who has a right to vote, which I don't know the figures for Canada, but the US has probably the lowest number of voters in the world. And also there are millions of people who can't vote, who are not allowed to register to vote, either past criminal convictions, or they might not be legal, or there's just endless number of reasons people can't and don't vote in the US. Not that their votes here count, but nevertheless, it would be important to look at who had to vote in Venezuela, and how many candidates, how many positions are up for the different elections.
Okay, I can answer that if you like. There are 10 candidates. One is Maduro, and the other 9 are opposition leaders. These are 9 different opposition parties that are standing for the presidency. The only position that is being voted on right now is for the presidency. Now, what happened was that the most fascist of the oppositions got together and formed this PUD party, and the one who wanted to be the candidate was Maria Corina Machado, but Maria Corina Machado cannot be elected because she was disqualified by the courts and by the Supreme Court. I'll tell you in a minute why. And so she has a puppet that she's put in, who is this decrepit old man who's never been in politics except as a political hack behind the scenes, helping, by the way, in El Salvador with the logistics and the funding of the death squads there in the 80s and 70s. That is the nice old gentleman that the press in the United States talks about, this sinister old fellow who is good for nothing. So he is the Edmundo González, right? But everybody knows that if he were to win, the person who really would be governing would be Maria Corina Machado. So there are 10 parties, 10 opposition parties, and only one Chavista candidate, which is Maduro. Now, the thing I want to explain is that in Venezuela, anyone who is a citizen and who is of age, I think it's 18, can vote. It is not like in other countries that if you're in jail, you can't vote, or if you were a felon, you can't vote. Everybody can vote. Indeed, people in the prisons can vote in Venezuela. The other thing about Venezuelans is that they love to vote. Just a week ago, we had which was called a simulacro, which was a mock voting in order to test the machines and to test the whole process. And this was on a Sunday. And thousands upon thousands of Venezuelans went to the polling station to cast their mock vote, which counted for nothing because they weren't counting the votes. It was just to make sure that everything was going well. One of my old sisters who was blind, she went to vote in this mock voting with her daughter taking her. And as soon as she got there, she immediately was taken to the front of the line, and she was able to have what's called assisted voting, and she voted. And there were long lines of people waiting. And as they waited there, other people came to entertain them, and especially with the drums. So they were drumming and playing guitar, and it was all quite happy. And one of the things that one of the Venezuelans was telling me was the following. During the other governments, before the Bolivarian government, there were thousands upon thousands of Venezuelans who could not vote. They lived in the shanty towns. Some of them were 2-3 generation from Colombia. They had no ID. They couldn't get an ID because they didn't know how to read and write. And then these governments, these elitist governments, would hold the voting in all the private schools, which are in the nice areas of town. So these people would have to travel a long while to get to these voting stations, and only those who had the ID were allowed to get in. So this person was telling me, that's why we like to vote now, because now we can all vote. You know, there are voting stations in every neighborhood, in every school. Things are done to help people vote. Like my sister, who was blind, she is able to vote, even she can't see. And none of this happened before. So Venezuelans absolutely love to vote. This is so different. I live in Canada, and whenever an election is called, the only thing I hear is, oh, what a drag. Oh, goodness, elections. I'm going to miss going to the cottage because of these elections, or things of the sort. But not in Venezuela. In Venezuela, people take the vote very, very seriously. And there were enormous amount of people in the mock elections, which shows that when the real elections come on Sunday, we're not going to see a lot of absenteeism.
We have a good challenging question. And it's important because we can think we're answering things as we explain sanctions, but it does take expanding on it again and again. And that is the question, why are so many people leaving Venezuela? Is it solely the sanctions? Of course, I have my explanation for this, but let me toss it to Joe and to Maria.
Okay, yeah, if you look at I looked into the data. I could post a link to it at some point, but if you look at the data from even from opposition sources like INCOVI, this survey that these opposition academics put out every so often, overwhelmingly the migration from Venezuela states it takes place after Trump dramatically intensified economic sanctions in 2017. Now, of course, it seems to have started in 2016 when it really began to be significant for Venezuela. But most of it takes place after 2017, after Trump intensified the sanctions. And the other thing is that there's a tremendous exaggeration, opportunities for double counting with the migration, because people flow from one country to another. So there's all sorts of errors and exaggerations in the numbers, but there's definitely been massive migration. But it undeniably stems from the sanctions, because remember, the sanctions started the broad economic sanctions started in 2015. So we have the migration that really takes off in 2016, and then we have what the majority of taking place after 2017, when Trump intensified the sanctions. So I don't see any reason to dispute that the sanctions are the overwhelming cause of the migration.
I'd like to add a little something. You're quite right. Absolutely right, Joe. And also, there was an actual campaign to get people to go on these migrations. This was orchestrated, and there were people out there luring, especially, it was very sad because they were luring the working class people. They were luring working class people and promising them and of course, where were they luring them to? To the right-wing governments, to Peru, to Colombia, to places like that, and of course to the United States. And they were actually given a couple $100 so that they could migrate. And they were assured that, oh, they're going to get there, they're going to get their green card, they're going to get a job, they're going to have everything that they don't have here. And of course all that exploded, and none of that occurred. Some of these people ended up living on the streets. Some of them were treated very, very badly by the Colombians, by the Peruvians, by the Argentinians. I mean, it was just terrible, because these people arrived expecting jobs in countries where there were no jobs. And then, of course, they went to the United States, and they were caught in that nightmare of the frontier with the United States. But there was an absolute campaign to gear these people. And I want to mention again, this reprobate son of someone that we know in our family who was in there with American money, okay, trying to lure these people so that he could take them to Panama, and it was all very, very murky and awful. But thousands and thousands have come back through this Vuelta a la Patria, where the government sends them their the planes. But undoubtedly, as Joe says, this never would have happened if we had not had these intense sanctions that started in 2015.
Thank you, Maria. I'm going to jump one thing I think always needs to be addressed, and really just and that is the preferential treatment given to Venezuelan, Nicaraguan, and Cuban migrants to the U.S. And they know if they are able to get into the U.S., they are guaranteed certain services. But those who counter and can very strictly enforce, migrants from Guatemala, Honduras, where some come, from Haiti, from African countries, they can cross the Darien Gap with Venezuelans. That doesn't mean we'll get in across the U.S. border. So the preferential treatment, why is that? The U.S. wants particularly Venezuelan, Nicaraguan, Cuban migrants here in terms of their propaganda, very important, and in terms of strengthening, reinforcing a current in each of these countries. So, and yet you won't see that on countries that the U.S. is not targeting, except to ensure difficult conditions. You know what? We're reaching 8:23. I think, and both of you can see both Q&A. There's good questions there, and also some in the chat. But you can move it into your kind of concluding comments, or handle one of those questions or comments that are up there, and just to assure people that we will send out a link to this on YouTube just about as soon as it passes. And also, Joe Lombardo, if you have a closing comment, that would also be fine. And we're very excited by, I'll say that, we're very excited about the turnout tonight. It shows.
Sarah, you froze. Let me just say, while Sarah's still frozen, that after for anybody who registered, that 24 hours after the webinar ends, Zoom will send you, and it will be under Zoom. It'll say Zoom on it. Thank you for attending, or thank you for registering and not attending. And in that will be a link to the video. So it will also be put up on YouTube and sent out through various ways. But if you look at that notice from Zoom, you will, tomorrow, you will see the link to the video.
Joe EMERSBERGER, let me pass it to you, unless I'm still frozen.
No, you're not, no.
Okay. I don't know where you lost me on the last one. So sorry. Is Joe EMERSBERGER still there?
I'm here. I'm here. Yes. What was it I was asked to say? I'm sorry. I can't
Oh,
hear you, Joe.
I didn't know if you had a closing comment or if looking at the chat or the Q&A,
Yeah, some
you have
questions.
anything you want to add?
Just real quick about the Q&A. Elena Duhan, the special rapporteur, had a very detailed report that went into some of the there were sanctions that weren't broad economic sanctions that date back to 2005. I see people ask about. So Elena Duhan, in her report as special rapporteur a few years ago, she addressed all that. So that'd be worth looking up online. And also the Venezuela analysis, I just want to mention real quick, they did a really good infographic that gave all the candidates, all 10 candidates in their political platforms, their general tendencies and all that. So that's worth looking up as well. And that's really all I have. And I'm just, again, I hope Maduro wins. And that's what I'm pulling for on what I'll be pulling for on Sunday, because it's a victory for the entire world, and it'll be a defeat for the U.S. empire. So that's what I got.
Okay, thank you, Joe. I don't know if I was frozen early when I did this, but I'll say that from SanctionsKill Campaign, we produced a book called Sanctions, a Wrecking Ball in a Global Economy. And on the very opening page, it listed the 40 sanctioned countries, which often there's no recognition, and it is why we use the term economic coercive measures. We don't say actually unilateral coercives, because there are also sanctions imposed through the UN and through the European Union and so on, under US pressure and enforced by the US. But each of them, if it's sanctions on Korea, on Iraq, on Iran, it has the same impact, whether it is the UN that's imposing it under US pressure, or directly from the US. All of these sanctions, Tarlians, and we want to oppose them. We also, this brochure, sanctions, deadly, destructive, and violation of international law. And I do hope you'll check out Joe Emersberger's book, Extraordinary Threat, the US Empire, the Media, and 20 Years of Coup Attempts in Venezuela. It's really, just the number of facts and of information is great, is a resource. So I think that's it. We're going to end with that. It is just about at 8:30. And I want to thank the panelists. I want to thank the Venezuela Solidarity Network. So many of them are in Venezuela right now for the elections, and they are in direct contact, and they're going to be coming back with so many. I think 2 days after, they're giving a whole sort of sum up of their experience. There are a number of other webinars coming up that they list, and please do tune into them, because this solidarity becomes a material force when we organize it, really a force for historic change. And we should be confident in that, as they are in Venezuela today.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Joe. Both Joes. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Look for the video.